Hey everyone, I know I haven't updated my shopping list tab in the Endgame analysis spreadsheet in quite some time now, so today I decided I would make a video updating it a bit, talking about how I updated it. A couple things before we start. So the shopping list, for those of you who are not aware, it's basically like a resource for new players, returning players, veterans, what have you, to have a starting point in understanding what are the important meta weapon functions and roles in this game for endgame content. So that's number one. Number two, I've also made this new status tab in the endgame analysis spreadsheet. It just kind of shows you when I last touched everything in the spreadsheet. There's a lot of different tabs, even more than the boss damage spreadsheet. And the boss damage spreadsheet has a strict date change log. The change log in this spreadsheet is kind of based on like what's going on at the time in the game rather than like specific dates. So I was like, when people ask me questions like, when did you last update this? Are you planning on updating this? Why is this weapon not in this tab or whatever? This hopefully will answer that so that you guys can see what I'm currently working on and what I think is currently up to date. So that's number two. Number three, I've also updated the speedrunner shopping list. So for those of you who are speedrunning and you want to know what to get as a new speedrunner, this is like the most important stuff. There's a priority system here, 1 being the most important, 3 being the least important, and then not applicable being stuff that is no longer in the speedrunning meta as a result of different changes or new weapons being better than old weapons. So that is basically all I wanted to say for the intro. So let's actually get into the shopping list itself and talk about why it looks a little different than it used to look. So first, let's talk about this priority system. So number one, I've moved the priority system from the speedrunner shopping list and I've put it onto the main shopping list as well. The reason for this is because before it was kind of just a list of weapons, and while that is kind of what a shopping list is, I do think if this is to serve as a guideline for newer players or people that are needing some guidance, I think having a priority system is good because it tells you what you need to get first, basically, right? I think the high priority weapons are stuff that has a lot of coverage, has a lot of versatility, and is most likely something that you're going to be reliant on in most content in this game, right? Whereas the low tier stuff, I'm not saying this is like F tier or anything, these are not bad by any stretch, it's just you're less likely to use them. So there are some instances where you may end up using these, and there are some instances where these may even be the best option that you have, but those instances are either going to be uncommon or close to non-existent. So that's why we have this priority system here. And a couple other things that I've changed about the actual structure of this shopping list. Number one, you'll see here that the leftmost column is no longer the name of the weapon. And that's because I want people to focus on looking at the shopping list as a list of identities, as a list of roles, a list of functions, right? Because you choose a weapon to fill a specific need in endgame content. And so if I kind of just put the names of weapons here, people are just going to take it at face value and be like, oh, I need this weapon specifically. Now, some weapons are so good at what they do, either because of their exotic effect or because of a unique perk combination, or maybe they're the first of an archetype ever, right? For example, like VS Velocity Baton is the only area denial frame in the energy slot. In those cases, there are not going to be any alternatives, but in most cases, you'll see here that a lot of weapons do fill the same role. I'm going to give you what I think is the best in slot option as the option that is named, but there, just keep in mind that there are alternatives, always alternatives. Okay, so that is that. Let's go ahead and talk about what's actually in this shopping list for season 25 or episode Revenant. So first up, we have VS Velocity Baton. It's the only energy area denial frame in the game. I think utility-wise, it is more useful than Lost Signal. Lost Signal obviously builds Darkness Transcendence really quickly off of groups of ads, but I do think the orb generation potential of attrition orbs, especially in large groups of ads, is very, very strong. No matter what kind of class you're playing, even if you're not on Prismatic, this is great. And obviously the archetype is good as well, just generally good for ad clear. We also have a rocket sidearm in each slot. Now, rocket sidearms are not the most ammo efficient weapons generally anymore because of their reserve nerf. However, they are still good enough to be very potent in content where you're not super ammo restricted. So I'm talking about like normal difficulty raids and other endgame content where you're not super ammo starved, right? Or in content where you need something like a rocket sidearm, but you are using abilities to do your ad clear, so that you're not super pressed for ammo on top of using stuff like Special Finisher, right? So you can argue about the the placement of some of these rocket sidearms, but you get my point. You want a kinetic rocket sidearm, you want an energy rocket sidearm. They're very helpful, right? You also have a DPS heavy gel. So heavy gels are obviously the strongest weapon family when it comes to legendary heavies right now. So I do think having a DPS heavy gel is a good idea for a new player. Great for stuff like legend raids, great for stuff like fireteam dungeons. If you're solo, obviously the meta is going to be something like an exotic, but we'll get to that in a second. So best in slot, VS Chill Inhibitor, but obviously there are some decent alternatives as well in Bittersweet, Wicked Sister, and Edge Transit. So next up we have exotics. Now you might have noticed here that I have not included any legendary primaries in the high priority category. I would say in general, legendary primaries are very situational in endgame content. I know that might sound kind of weird, but generally when people want to use primaries and not double special, they will opt to have an exotic primary in order to increase their ammo output, on top of the fact that exotic primaries, especially those in the golden trifecta here, Sunshot, Graviton, Trinity, are very, very high potency to the point where they can compete with these special weapons that were once in that slot. So that's why I haven't really included legendary primaries, on top of the fact that legendary primaries vary wildly in terms of their strength. There's a ton of good options out there, but they all kind of fill the same role. And the role of needing a legendary primary is, generally speaking, not super necessary in most endgame content. Next up, we have exotic heavy. Now, I've separated exotic heavies into two different categories here. We have exotic consistent heavy, and I'm talking for DPS here, and then we have exotic total damage heavy, right? So generally speaking, when you're playing Destiny and you want consistent total damage, you're going to look to an exotic heavy weapon. Over the past couple years, D2 has shifted drastically away from legendary heavy weapons when it comes to total damage. And so a lot of the time, if you're doing something like a solo dungeon, or you're in just even like a fire team dungeon, or you're doing a master raid or something like that, anywhere where you're going to be trying to dump as much ammo as you can and you're not going to be one phasing, you want to use something like maybe a Levy Breath, a 1K, a Prospector, or a Microcosm. And then if you care less about DPS and more about total damage, then you can look into something like a Whisper or Grand Overture, as we saw in this past day one, or Legend of Acreus. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. Super consistent, easy options for, newbies to bring into something like a raid or a dungeon for their first time. Next up, we have exotic debuff. Now, this is arguably not as essential as the rest of the stuff here, but I still do think having Tractor Cannon on hand, especially if we ever get a season where you don't have a seasonal debuff, I think having Tractor on hand is very useful. Learning how to use it is very useful. A lot of activities, players will expect someone to be on Tractor in some cases. So yeah, Tractor is really good. Divinity here is a very loose alternative these days, with Divinity's nerf, having to hold it down, number one, and number two, being nerfed from 30%, and then number three, of course, the entire sandbox shifting towards weaken, so 15%, the same debuff that Divinity gives, being way less valuable because of how easy it is to access, because of Prismatic, like Transcendence debuff uptime. You have stuff like Withering Gaze snipers, you have like concussive reload from the artifact. As a result of stuff like this, Divinity is super, super niche, but it is technically an exotic debuff, so I did want to include it here. The only thing I'm not going to include here is Deterministic Chaos, because unlike Divinity, Deterministic Chaos does not really provide any exotic benefit that makes it worth bringing over something like a Withering Gaze sniper, because Divinity actually does create a crit on bosses that is consistently and easily something that your teammates can aim at, whereas Deterministic Chaos does nothing of the sort. Next up, we have the medium priority category. So the medium priority category, I would say overall, is weapons that are very strong, but the situations that you use them in, that they shine in, are not generally universal. So a good example is like No Hesitation. Support auto rifle is one of the most OP ways of helping you and one of your teammates survive like a difficult mechanic, maybe in a very combat dense section. It's also a way of providing you and your teammates a 10% stacking damage boost, which can be very useful in some damage optimized scenarios. And so because of those two factors not being super universal, it's not going to find its way into the high priority category, but you can see why a weapon like this is super valuable in endgame content. The same applies to stuff like Ergo, 1-2-punch shotguns, weaken on demand. All of this stuff is important, but it's not absolutely essential, and it's not stuff that you're necessarily going to bring in most content, right? Ergo, you might want to use an exotic primary because of ammo constraints. Exotic specials are some of the worst ammo generation weapons in the game. You have, Perfect Paradox, only really relevant on melee builds. You have Valletta F, which really depends on whether or not you have access to weaken in your build, or whether or not you have something like concussive reload in the artifact. This is only relevant when champs are there. Supremacy is only relevant if snipers are relevant. You have Lost Signal, which is, decent ad clear, but I wouldn't say that Transcendence build is as important as something like just generating a crap load of orbs. We have, movement swords. Again, movement is not necessarily something super important in all content. Machine guns are really nice to have, right? You could argue maybe machine guns need to be higher on this list, but I would say for ad clear, for the most part, abilities are fine, rocket items are fine. And obviously, if you choose to use a machine gun, you are limiting yourself to content where you do not have a heavy DPS weapon, right? So maybe content like missions and strikes, or maybe content like GMs where you're not necessarily running DPS weapons all the time and you're going to prioritize more on ammo efficient ad clear. Finally, again, energy primary. I do think energy legendary primaries are generally more applicable than kinetic legendary primaries. And I think it's pretty clear why. When we think of the best PvE legendary primaries, I think in my opinion, like the top 5 or 10 that come to mind are all energy based, right? You have access to stuff like heal clip. You have access to really powerful splash perks like incandescent, volt shot, jolting feedback, all these new perks, these excellent splash perks that frankly the kinetic slot doesn't really have access to. You have some weapons with like, chill clip, you have some weapons with like hatchling, you have some weapons with even like kinetic tremors, which is decent, but I don't think any of them really hold a candle to some of the best energy options. And I think generally speaking, using an energy primary and like a kinetic special tends to be a better pairing than vice versa. So I hope that makes sense. We have 2 exotics here. We have Galahorn, which is kind of situational. You don't necessarily always need some crazy amount of ad clear from your heavy weapon. And when you do, I think Galleys, and Thunderlord are all good examples of just really consistent, strong ad clear options that are just shoot and forget. But that doesn't really tend to be a super important thing in endgame content in 2024. A lot of the time that can just be covered by your abilities or something like a rocket sidearm or an area denial frame or like sunshot, right? So not super important. We also have Parasite. I think Parasite is pretty underrated in general, but it's still not like so dominant that I would put it in the high priority category. It's a nice thing for a new player to have for bosses like Atrax or for just roam content for killing champions and stuff like that. But you can certainly live without it, and it certainly has its replacements. Its job can be done, maybe to a lesser degree by a more consistent total damage based heavy weapon. Next we have the low category. So the low category is a bunch of different stuff here, which I'm going to go over just fairly quickly. So we have energy 1-2 punch. Generally speaking, kinetic slot tends to be the 1-2 punch slot of choice for most players, so that's why energy 1-2 punch shotguns are significantly lower. We have ammo-less damage and technically super generation and transcendence generation as well in like really underlight content. Outbreak is really good there. We have kinetic burst shotgun heritage, more of a speedrunny type weapon, not super important for a new player to have. We have damage snipers like Omniscient Eye, again not super important, very very niche these days. Good legendary weapon total damage, but again not something that most players are going to value. Usually you're going to be using something like Whisper or something like Grand Overture if you value total damage. You're not really going to be relying on a sniper for the most part unless you need it for backup damage, which I would say is low priority and not high priority. We also have some fusion rifles. Again, the fusion rifles are not super great in the meta right now. They're just okay, but if you need a fusion rifle because of like a champ mod or something like that, or you're on tracker and you want like a super easy damage option, you don't want to use a shotgun, fusion rifles exist. Mountaintop, again, I think most people are super familiar with using an eager edge sword. Mountaintop is kind of in that same category, except vertical movement is, I suppose, not super as important as like an eager edge sword. I think a lot of people understand the importance of an eager edge sword. I don't know, I suppose I could move Mountaintop a little bit higher, but again, not super important unless you're like a speedrunner regardless. And I wouldn't say like as a legendary weapon it's super important to obtain Mountaintop outside of movement for the most part. Waveframes, again, yeah, kind of low priority. If you have a rocket sidearm, you're almost never going to be itching to use a waveframe in either slot. I mean, obviously these have some nice rolls here. Slideways post buff is cool. You have incandescent on martyrs with a good origin trait, but again, like not super important, not like super reliant on these kinds of weapons in most endgame content. We have blinding GLs again. We have some of the best blinding GLs we've ever had in this game that currently exists right now. Wilder Flight, Liturgy, bunch of blinding GL options, but again, blinding GLs are not super important these days. Really, I think a lot of people have embraced just nuking everything with like abilities like Consecration, and so blinding GLs don't tend to be super needed. We have Glaive. This is just a good generic glaive slot. I just put what I think are the best glaives. Whenever you're using a glaive, I mean, you're using it for a very specific reason. The only reason why I put rake angle above everything else is because it has chill clip. So if you are ever in a GM with overloads, then technically you can take this glaive and just completely ignore the artifact because it has chill clip, which is nice. You have special shoot to loot, very much a speedrunner thing. I would say most people who do endgame content don't really need to worry about having a shoot to loot trace rifle, even if it is nice to have. We have DPS sword and DPS rocket. The DPS rocket thing might move up a little bit. once I do some damage testing on Envious Arsenal, Bait and Switch Tomorrow's Answer, might be more of a meta pick then. But until then, at least, I think rockets are some of the least important weapons for a new player to have, unless you plan on maybe doing fire team GMs with non-titans, I suppose, and you're using rockets as your ad clear strategy. Then I suppose having a decent rocket is a good idea. But again, that's pretty small use case, and even in that use case, there's a lot of rockets you can take that are not Tomorrow's Answer or something super specific. DPS sword, there's some encounters where swords are still used. Herald comes to mind, Riven comes to mind. Again, not the most optimal choice even for some of those encounters, but people will tend to put you on swords or ask you to be on swords. So Summon Bonum is obviously the best one there, but there's some other options like Geodetic and Bequest that you can take on as well. And finally, in the last stretch here, we have linears. Linears, I just don't really recommend them for anything, but I kind of wanted to have a category for them just so we can say, like, if you want a linear, this is the best one. Scintillation, there you go. Kinetic primaries, again, not really super important. I know a lot of people are farming for stuff like Multi-Mock and Imminence, and I know Accrued Redemption has like 2-shot kinetic tremors. The only reason, in my opinion, to take a kinetic primary is because you need to, right? So a good example would be maybe you're doing like, I don't know, like Solo Witness is like a good example I can think of, right? Where you have Still Hunt and then you need a primary in your kinetic slot. That's when you'd be like, okay, I'm whipping out the Imminence or whatever, right? But you would, generally speaking, never take a kinetic primary by choice, right? It tends to be something that you're forced to because you're taking an exotic special, or you're taking an energy special that's not exotic. It just tends to be a position you're forced into. Generally speaking, I think most players, if given the choice between running a kinetic or an energy primary, they would agree that the energy primary pool in this game is more diverse and has much better and more potent options. We have our Lucky Pants hand cannons. I don't think there's really any controversy here. Lucky Pants, I believe Heavy Burst hand cannons got a buff, like an additional buff. So remember how I said that Heavy Burst hand cannons did not actually receive a nerf for whatever reason from the Lucky Pants change because they also got a stealth buff? Well, apparently Bungie buffed them again by 9%, so I'm going to test their damage a bit, but that will make them even better for Lucky Pants stuff. So I'm excited. We're going to do some damage rotation testing stuff over the next 1 or 2 weeks, so I'm excited for that. Finally, we have exotics that are in the low priority category. We have exotic kinetic primary, which I think Kvostov is the exotic kinetic primary that scales the best into endgame content, mostly because it's on hit and has some pretty decent stopping power. You have Necrochasm as well, which is more of a killing spree base. I gave Bad Juju a shout out, Huckleberry. They all got some buffs this season, and I tried them out in master content, and they seem to be doing okay in that content. I'm not going to be the first person to recommend the use of exotic kinetic primaries. This is largely a preference-based thing outside of super hard content, and in super hard content, I think most people are still going to opt for the energy slot options or exotic primaries. We have exotic burst special and stuff like Fourth Horseman, Choir, Still Hunt, Izzy. Again, the need for burst damage in endgame content is not really there for the most part, unless you're in something like a day one and you're time sensitive, you need to kill a tormentor or something. Might be a good idea to take one of these weapons, but again, it's kind of for a new player. For most endgame content, burst is not like a super big priority, especially for your special weapon, especially if you're kind of like wasting it on your exotic slot. Choir being the only weapon here that's like ammo efficient and functions outside of that rule. Finally, we have exotic survivability, which is Buried Bloodline. I put Red Death Reformed here because it's like same slot and kind of does, is something like that. It's a survivability exotic, but I don't recommend Red Death Reformed. Buried Bloodline is just, it's a rocket sidearm, has great ammo reserves even post rocket sidearm nerf, and you can swap off it. You can give Devour to any subclass. Very versatile. The only thing is this level of survivability, much like the support frame auto rifle, is not really needed. And of course, you are using an exotic special, which again, I've talked about in the past why exotic specials are generally a big pressure point for loadouts that can compromise your decision making. And then last but not least, we have Euphony. This is just like a total damage option. Basically, like, let's say you're running like Levy, or you're running Whisper, or you're running 1k, or whatever it is, and you're out of heavy ammo, and you're like, well, I may as well switch my heavy to something else and run an exotic special. You would either switch to Euphony or Cloud Strike, right? So those are your two options. Cloud Strike obviously being the more universally applicable choice, given that you don't need to run like Threat of Evolution or anything like that. Whereas Euphony is a bit stronger if you decide to run Strand, or you care even more about total damage than you do with Cloud Strike. Cloud Strike has a bit less total damage, but higher DPS. So that's pretty much it for the shopping list. I mean, yeah, I hope you guys found this entertaining. Hope you guys found this educational. The next video I'm probably going to talk about is the perk and origin trait update video. I'm working on farming weapons for the damage rotation testing that we're going to be doing pretty soon. As you can see here in the ranking tab, for those of you that are interested, I pretty much set up every rotation that I want to test this season. There's some really cool stuff here. For example, like the last word is being used with chill inhibitor. Very excited. I need to get my hands on some weapon rolls though before we get started. So yeah, until then, I will see you guys around. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video where we talk about origin traits and perks and how I've changed a lot of these lists because, frankly, especially like the perk tier list was very, very big, a very ambitious goal. And obviously, you know, with however many perks there are in this game, hundreds, 200, you know, we were going to need to make some changes. So yeah, excited to talk about that, and I'll see you then.